So Daniel chapter 11. It's divided into two major parts or two major themes in Daniel chapter 11. 1 through 35, which describes the major rulers of the Persian Empire. Details of the empire of Alexander the Great, and would conclude in 35 as we get through to the end of 35 with Antiochus and Epiphanes. The rest of chapter 11, 36 through probably even 36 through 45 easily deals with end times, deals with millennial kingdom issues. You will no doubt take notice that this part that we're in here, 1 through 35, much like chapter 8, draws a circle around those Gentile rulers who had a negative influence on the people of Israel. Gentile rulers who had a negative influence on the people of Israel. That is one of the big keys of this. We will also see that the entirety of the church age is skipped in Daniel. There is zero about the church age in the book of Daniel. There's nothing about the church age in the book of Daniel. Because, why is that? Because it is written to Israelites. Written to Israelites. 1 through 35 delivers exceedingly detailed prophecy, the likes of which is not found elsewhere in Scripture. The accuracy of that text in 1 through 35 has brought a lot of criticism by the critics, or the ire of the critics. They use the accuracy of the prophecy to claim that it is false. They would use the accuracy of the prophecy that we found here to claim that it was written after the time of the events that occurred, that it prophesies about. Now, I don't hold to any of that. It is written by Daniel during the time of the Babylonian captivity and whatnot. There's a number of world leaders that are going to be mentioned in this: the kings of Persia, the kings of Greece, the kings of Egypt, and the kings of Syria. Both the south would be Egypt, the north would be Syria. And then, of course, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is also from Syria, is where that's at. It is going to cover a time frame from about 529, 530 BC through probably 164 BC. That's the period of time that is covered, somewhere in that neighborhood. So about 400 years is what's covered in these 35 verses of Daniel. These 35 verses of Daniel. I'm going to take them in part because mine spreads across almost two full pages of the Bible. I'm going to take them in part and talk about them, talk about what it's talking about in those, and then we'll move on until we get to, obviously, the end of 35. So the first two verses, we can call this the messenger in the context is there. Now, the messenger, remember we met him in chapter 10, that angel that is there, and it says in verse 11, chapter 1, I'll read 11, 1 and 2. Now I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to strengthen and to be a fortress for him. So now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to stand in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the kingdom of Greece. So this part here, we have that marker again, is the first year of Darius the Mede, in which the angel, the one who strengthened Daniel, 10:18, this is the one with the appearance of a man who touched me again and strengthened me, right, would confirm and support him. Since the first year is mentioned, it means that from the beginning this support was there. And it says there, now I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to strengthen and to be a fortress for him, for Darius the Mede. Okay? The text says that the angel, that standing is a military term that is used here. It means that in that first year of Darius, the Babylonian kingdom ended. The Medes come in. The Medo-Persian kingdom comes in. The power would pass to Medo-Persia. The fact that the angel stood would indicate that And we could even pull Michael into this, because Michael was pulled back there, is that remember, we have him who's battling for 21 days, would indicate that they stood as guardians of Israel and would remain so until the Medo-Persian kingdom's hostility towards Israel turned to their favor. Now think about this. What the angel is saying there, I stood to strengthen and to be a fortress for Darius the Mede. In other words, I'm doing this thing until the favor turns back towards Israel. Or we could say it this way, to the outward hostility turns away from Israel for this period of time. And we know this period of time happens because what do? They go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and then to rebuild Jerusalem, right? So we have that picture that it has turned, that hostility against Israel has turned to a degree for a period of time. We see that favor has turned significantly. Remember way back in Daniel chapter 6, if you just turn back there just for a moment, that hostility turned away, right? Daniel chapter 6, right? Darius's officials seek to accuse Daniel. And then in Daniel chapter 6, when he survives the lion's den, in verse 24 through 27, what happens? How is it turned? It says, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every tongue who were inhabiting all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and to be in dread before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be unto the end. He saves and delivers and does signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So we can see that shifting away from that hatred there. So that kind of sets the angel, what he's talking about, what the messenger is saying here. And then he says, next, he says, so now I would tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to stand in Persia. 3 more kings are going to stand in Persia, and that's going to be Cambius, 529 to 522 BC, Pseudo-Smerdis, 522 to 521 BC, Darius the First, Histopessus, 521 to 486 BC. We see him in Ezra chapters 5 through 6. And then he says there, then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong, though, through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the kingdom of Greece. And that is Xerxes the First. Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. Xerxes, with this final one here, would use a period of 4 years to amass one of the largest armies of the ancient world, hundreds of thousands of men. And it says there, arouse the whole empire against Greece, the kingdom of Greece. And he would go against Greece, but it would end in disaster, and he would never recover. And they would never recover. It would end that Medo-Persian empire. And it would lead to the rise of the next greatest empires in history. And over all this, we see God's sovereignty in all this. Right? Remember, this is the angel that's giving this information. And the angel is giving this information for Daniel. It is all after him. For us, a large part of this has already occurred. Okay? For Daniel, everything is in the future. For us, a lot of this has occurred, except for a part that isn't. We can look back and say, I see exactly who this is, understand who this is. So he arouses the kingdom of Greece, and it says in verse 3 and 4, and a mighty king will stand, and he will dominate with great domination and do as he pleases. But as soon as he stands, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. But not to his own descendants, nor according to his domination with which he dominated, for his kingdom will be uprooted and given to others besides them. This king that will stand is Alexander the Great. That unsuccessful attack on Greece by Xerxes would bring the wrath of Greece against Persia. And that sets that stage for the rise of Alexander the Great. And there's no question that the moniker fits. He was an exceedingly intelligent military leader. And his stratagem is still being studied today. Of course, we remember our first encounter with Alexander the Great was in chapter 8, verse 8. chapter 8, verse 8, which spoke of his quick rise and his equally quick fall. Remember, he died when he was in his early 30s. In these verses, the angel gives some more details. And as we have noted before, and is repeated here with the fall of Alexander the Great, right? Notice how he says there, as soon as he stands, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out towards the four winds of heaven. The four winds of heaven. His kingdom, four would arise. Four of his generals would come up, and the kingdom would be split. And it says there, notice how it says, none of his own descendants, none of his own descendants would rise in power. His half-brother, Philip Arrhidaeus, was murdered in 317 BC. His youngest legitimate son, Alexander, was born after his death and was murdered in 310 BC. Alexander's death, of course, occurred before that, 323 BC, but as these all rise into power and separate the kingdom. But all these things would be fulfilled in a period of time between Alexander's death and 301 BC. So again, we have the accuracy of the prophecy that is given. The next up would be the kings of the south. And the kings of the south and the kings of the north. And that covers verses 5 through 20. Now, these are going to be broken up in smaller chunks. And in verse 5, it says here, so we had the fall of Alexander the Great. Remember, this is covering hundreds of years in prophecy. In verse 5, it says, then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes who will grow strong over him and obtain dominion. Indeed, his dominion will be a great dominion. Verse 5 marks the battle between the kings of the south of both Egypt and of Syria. Now, what sits between Egypt and Syria? Well, the nation of Israel sits between them two. They're always going to be suffering between the wars between those two. This would be Ptolemy the first Soter and Seleucus the first Necator would be that. So Seleucus is from Syria. Ptolemy is from Egypt. This would cover a period, and the period of time that is going to be covered in here is probably 150 years, even beyond those two. That prince referenced in that passage is Seleucus from Syria. And both Ptolemy and Seleucus would take a title of the king somewhere around the area of 306 BC, and they would be rivals due to the proximity of their territories. In verse 6 it says, and after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out an equitable arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he continue to stand with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and the one who fathered her, as well as he who strengthened her in those times. This is the marriage between the daughter of Egypt and the king of Syria. The daughter of the king of Egypt and the king of Syria. It's a political alliance that is formed through intermarriage. It would be the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who lived between 285 and 246 BC, and his daughter is Berenice, who would marry Antiochus II Theos. Okay, so this is what we have from Egypt to marrying the Syrian king. Ptolemy would require Antiochus, this is interesting, to divorce his first wife, Laodicea, to marry Berenice. And this would set up so many problems. When Ptolemy dies, the father of the one that is of the daughter getting married dies, Antiochus would return to his first wife, Laodicea, and then she would murder both him, Berenice, and their infant son. The wife that was put aside to create this marriage, and then she would murder all three of those, is what would happen. In verses 7 through 9, it says, but one of the descendants of her line will stand in his place, and he will come against their military force and enter the fortress of the king in the north, and he will deal with them and display strength. Verse 8, and also their gods with their metal images and their desirable vessels of silver and gold he will bring into captivity to Egypt. And he, on his part, will stand back from attacking the king in the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the kingdom of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. These verses will demonstrate the accuracy of Daniel's prophecy 300 or so years before the events that occur. That new king, Ptolemy III Euergetes, would arise in Egypt. He would be militarily superior to the king of the south, Seleucus Kalliankes, and this is demonstrated that he enters that fortress of that king. Ptolemy was the brother of the murdered Berenice and was the successor of Ptolemy Philadelphus. He would erect a monument called the Marmor Adultanum that would claim that he subjugated Mesopotamia, Persia, Susinia, Media, and the territories as far as Bactria. So we have this picture of all of these kings. And what is the angel doing? He's saying, listen, this is what is going to happen in the future. This is what is going to happen in the future. What do we fear the most? We fear the unknown. We fear the unknown. We fear the things that we don't know what are going on. Now, all this is occurring around where the nation of Israel is at. All this intrigue and stuff that's going on. Verses 10 through 12 give us the conflict between the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties, between both the Syrian and the Egyptian dynasties. 10 through 12 says, and his sons will wage war so that they will gather a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. And the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will cause a great multitude to stand, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. Then the multitude will be carried away. His heart will be lifted up and will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. Now you see all this and you say, this one history point after another, but what is the point of giving all this? The angel is giving this and saying, listen, nation of Israel, Daniel is writing this down. When these things happen, do not be afraid. When these things occur, understand that this is all within the purview of the sovereign God of happening. This is what is going to happen. I'm foretelling you what history is going to be. So you don't need to be concerned with where you stand or whether or not God's plans are coming to pass, because I'm telling you what is going to happen. So this section prophetically describes the conflict between the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties. It follows the failure of Seleucus Kalliankes to defeat Egypt and his successors, for to his sons that carried on commands. He would be killed in battle. Antiochus the Great, his brother, would rise. Antiochus III the Great, who would successfully wage many campaigns against Egypt. He would restore significant parts of the territory to Syria, advancing as far as Gaza, as far south as Gaza. So we're right in Israeli territory. So what would happen? There would be a great battle called the Battle of Raphia, where the tension would culminate, where the Egyptian army led by Ptolemy and his sister wife Arsinoe defeated Antiochus. Both sides, now think about this, in this period of time, commanded armies of roughly 70,000 soldiers. I mean, these are significant. And the victory fulfilled the prophecy that the Syrian forces would fall into Egyptian hands. But even so, it says in there, that Ptolemy's indolence prevented him from pursuing Antiochus further into Syria, and allowed the latter to escape and eventually bring a temporary peace between the two nations. Right? And this would set the stage or shift the stage for further struggles between the two dynasties. Verses 13 and 17, there's more conflict that happens between there. Now again, they're hearing this. Daniel's writing this down. I'm writing this down. Here's what is going to happen. When your people are alive during this time and they look to your prophecy, they are going to understand what is happening. Now, understand this. You do not need the New Testament to understand the Old Testament. The Old Testament speaks for itself. The Old Testament is understandable by itself. The Old Testament was fully understandable by the people who received it. They weren't looking for some sort of secret decoder ring to understand the Old Testament. Right? So what we read in the Old Testament, right? It is a hermeneutical problem to say that you need the New Testament to understand the Old Testament. That's not true. Okay? So they would understand what was written here. They would see this, and they would, when these events start ticking off in history, they'd say, oh, I know what this means. I know what this means. And we were told that this was coming. 13 through 17 is, I'm going to go quickly over that. There's so much there. And the king of the north will again cause a much greater multitude than the former to stand. And at the end of the times of those years, he will keep on coming with a great military force and much equipment. Now in those times, many will stand against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to cause the vision to stand, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. And the might of the south will not stand, not even their choicest troops. For there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to stand in opposition to him. He will also stand for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand, and he will set his face to come with the authority of the whole kingdom, bringing with him an equitable proposal which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. I mean, it's just, we read this and we're like, what are they talking about? But when we look back and we see in the history, we can see exactly what it is. It's this Syrian-Egyptian war that is occurring. It continues to describe that conflict between the two, emphasizing that rise of Antiochus III the Great in his campaigns against Egypt. How he would assemble a powerful army and resume his attacks with the participation, what we see in there, of some Jewish factions with him who sided with him against Egypt. These Jewish collaborators are described as those violent among your own people. As the violent among their own people. He would receive significant victories, including the defeat of the Egyptian general Scopas at Panias in 198 BC in the well-fortified city. We see that cast up the siege ramp and capture the well-fortified city. These series of successes allowed Antiochus to occupy the land of Israel as far south as Gaza. Attempts by 3 Egyptian leaders to rescue Scopas failed, fulfilling the prophecies that the forces of the south shall not stand. The forces of the south shall not stand. And then we see that talk about the daughter there in 197 BC. Facing the threat of Rome, Antiochus sought a diplomatic solution by betrothing his daughter Cleopatra to Egypt's young king Ptolemy V Epiphanes. This move was calculated to an effort to undermine Egypt from within, as suggested by that prophecy in verse 17. Give the daughter of women to destroy it. However, it would ultimately fail as Cleopatra sided with her husband over her father, thwarting his ambitions and his ambitions to weaken Egypt. And now I'm glad you're hanging with me on this. This is more of a history lesson than anything, but it's going to get to a very big point, I hope, here shortly. Verses 18 through 19. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a ruler will make his reproach against him cease. Moreover, he will repay him for his reproach, so he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. Describes that decline now of Antiochus III the Great after his earlier successes. The prophecy there of his reproach was fulfilled when he would arrogantly dismiss Roman envoys, asserting that Rome had no authority in Asia, that defiance would lead to his confrontation with Roman forces, because remember, they're rising under the leadership of Lucius Asiaticus. And Antiochus' ambition, remember, he takes the great on there, was that to rival Alexander the Great by conquering Greece, resulted in defeats, and he had a great defeat at Thermopylae in 191 BC and Magnesia in 189 BC. They would mark the fulfillment of the prophecy and pave the way for Rome's expansion into the region, effectively ending Asiatic dominance in Europe. So those from the ancient Near East, right, that are over there in Asia, there are no longer. Rome is now on the rise. He would return to his land in defeat. He would plunder the temple of Bel in Elam, and he would be killed which would fulfill the prophecy of verse 19, that he would stumble and fall and be found no more. It would lead to significant developments for Israel that would happen there. And these events, as foretold, with remarkable accuracy, highlight the divine inspiration of Daniel's prophecy, and it provides a detailed and predictive account of this critical historical period. Remember, this is happening all around Israel. When there's wars and rumors of wars, people tend to get very worried. What is going to happen to me? Right? Verse 20 would be about this Seleucus Philopator, who would raise the taxes. Then in his place one will stand, who will have an oppressor pass through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger nor in battle. He would rule between Antiochus the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes, and would be known for oppression of the people of Israel through taxation. Not the first time we've heard of this. He did this because Rome, why would he raise these taxes so much? Because Rome demanded a tribute of 1,000 talents every year, which is a huge amount of money. 2 Maccabees chapter 3, verse 7 tells us that the special taxes taken from the Jews were by a tax collector named Heliodorus, who also took treasures from the temple of Jerusalem. So this Seleucus Philopator was suddenly removed under mysterious circumstances. Many point to the fact they think he was poisoned. But this all leads to the point which I'm trying to quickly get through. Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes comes into power. This is the one we want to talk about. Verses 21 through 23. All that leads up to this period of time, to Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. And we've talked about him before. Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. The little horn. His rule would be from 175 to 164 BC. Now think about when Daniel's writing this prophecy. 400 or so years have passed when this comes out. This prophecy in 21 through 23, where it says this, and in his place, so this one is broken, goes under mysterious circumstances, and from Syria, we have this Antiochus Epiphanes, and it says in verse 21, and in his place a despised person will stand, to whom the splendor of the kingdom has not been given. But he will come in a time of ease and take hold of the kingdom by intrigue. But the overflowing might will be flooded away before him and broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. First section there, this prophecy focuses on the rise of Antiochus, the fourth Epiphanes, described as contemptible, reflecting both his character and his manner of ascent to power. Now remember, God has ordained this to occur. This is key to understand. These passages here, as I've referenced before, align with those early references in Daniel, that little horn in Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. This one who emerges during that Seleucid Empire's decline, in that his rule is highlighted because of its significant impact on the Jewish people, their temple worship, and events that later sparked the Maccabean revolt. So all the ones up between those had some effect on, up until we get here, have some effect on Israel because it's happening all around them, right? We have this thing. You have to understand that these wars that are occurring on, look, I'm telling you what's going to happen. This is going to happen. Here's these rulers are going to come. You're going to be able to see them. You're going to be able to understand. You read this prophecy, right? But now we're getting into focused evil towards the Jewish people through Antiochus Epiphanes. Right? This is where we're at. His rise fulfills the prophetic themes introduced in Daniel 8, where the little horn expands its influence through cunning and treachery, growing toward the glorious land, which is Israel. Daniel chapter 8, verses 23 through 25 foreshadows his methods of deceit, cruelty, and self-exaltation. That's Daniel 8, 23 through 25. The description here in 11:21 as a man to whom the splendor of the kingdom has not been given reflects his illegitimate path to power. He didn't rise through the right channels. he manipulated things to get there. Upon the death of his brother, Seleucus IV, Antiochus exploited that political instability that happens with the death of the ruler, posed as the guardian of the young heir, his brother's son, and then orchestrated the boy's murder to seize the throne. That's how he comes into power. He would use flattery and intrigue, as we note in verse 21, and that matches that description in Daniel chapter 8, verse 25. If you see 8:25, that he will cause deceit to succeed in his hand. He will magnify himself in his heart. He will destroy many while they are at ease. Right? He's just an evil person. His rise came at a time when that Syrian empire was weakened by internal strife and external pressures, particularly from Rome. He would manipulate alliances and conflicts to consolidate his position. Verse 23, which we read, mentions those deceitful agreements with other nations, particularly Egypt. Remember, it's deceitful. He has no intention of following through with what his promises are. Antiochus initially supported, at this time, the ruler in Egypt was Ptolemy VI Philometor in Egypt's internal power struggle, but did so only to exploit the situation for his own advantage. The tactics that he used enabled him to grow stronger, as is prophesied in Daniel chapter 8. There's this connection to the Maccabees, to the book of the Maccabees, which are intertestamental history of the Jewish people. Maccabeus means hammerer. Right? You'll read the story of the Jewish hammer that occurs there, the son of the one priest, the Jewish priest that was there who led the revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes and what they did there. These actions of him would set that stage for later atrocities to the Jewish people, which are described in detail in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 10 through 15. His rise and consolidation of power led directly to Hellenistic policies, including the desecration of the Jewish temple. Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, 1 Maccabees 1, verse 54 through 61. The Maccabean texts recount how Antiochus sought to eradicate Jewish religious practices and impose Greek culture. We'll get more on that later, leading to the widespread persecution and the eventual revolt led by Judas Maccabeus. So a couple key themes about him is the illegitimacy of his rule, that his seizure of power through flattering deceit contrasts with legitimate succession that is expected in monarchies, emphasizing this prophecy's focus on moral corruption. There's the divine sovereignty aspect. The prophecy in Daniel portrays Antiochus' rise and deceit as part of God's plan, showing that even wicked rulers fulfill divine purposes. Wicked rulers fulfill divine purposes. For what you meant for evil, I meant for good. What is that? Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Right? And it also shows the persecution of the covenant people, the people of Israel. His actions are described as treacherous and self-serving and culminate in direct oppression of the Jewish people, connecting his rise to the larger narrative of Gentile domination over Israel outlined in Daniel's earlier visions. So verses 24 through 26, in a time of ease he will enter the richest parts of the province, and he will do what his fathers never did, nor his fathers' fathers. He will distribute plunder, spoil, and possessions among them. He will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time, and he will stir up his strength and heart against the king of the south with a great military force. So the king of the south will wage war with an extremely large and mighty military force for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him, and those who eat his choice food will break him, and his military force will overflow, but many will fall down slain. He would expand his power through cunning and strategic actions, and unlike traditional military conquests, Antiochus attacked the wealthiest regions of his empire unexpectedly and during times of peace, catching his enemies off guard. The approach was part of his unique strategy to strengthen his rule. And one of the key ways that Antiochus secured loyalty was by redistributing wealth, the wealth he gained from these campaigns, buying favor. Instead of keeping the plunder for himself, he used it to reward his supporters and maintain their allegiance. That practice is highlighted in 1 Maccabees 3, verse 30. 1 Maccabees 3, verse 30, which notes his concern for continuing the lavish gifts that set him apart from his predecessors. Of course, this was not altruistic. It was a calculated move to ensure political stability and cooperation. In that verse 25, his military campaigns against Egypt, referred here as the king of the south, are introduced. And although the prophecy does not specify individual battles, it reflects the broader pattern of his reign. Bold military aggression combined with political manipulation. His attacks on Egypt achieved temporary victories, but they were not without challenges. Betrayal played a significant role in his success. As verse 26 foretells, those within the Egyptian king's own ranks conspired against him, contributing to Egypt's downfall. The internal treachery underscores Antiochus' ability to exploit division among his enemies to his advantage. Now remember, God is over all of this. All these things in great detail, that what he's saying that is directly going to affect the Israelites, is God is over all of this. God is sovereign over these things that are happening, yet he is fully responsible for everything he does. God is sovereign and man is fully responsible. You always have to hold those two things together. However, while his dominance over Egypt solidified his power, for a time it was always limited and temporary. Always limited and temporary. Verse 27 and 28. And as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak falsehood at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with great possessions, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. This unveils his, or shows his deceitful nature and malice that is there. The prophecy described these rival rulers, the two kings sitting at the same table but engaging in false negotiation. Both plotted against each other, speaking lies to gain the other hand. However, their schemes ultimately failed because the outcome was governed, how about by this, by God's sovereign timetable, not human plans. God doesn't miss the date. God doesn't show up late. He would then, after returning from Egypt, laden with wealth, he would direct his hatred and greed towards Israel. His heart was set against that holy covenant, symbolizing the opposition to the Jewish faith and worship practices. This would mark the beginning of his violent atrocities against the Jewish people, including the plundering of the temple and the desecration of their sacred practices. And now you could look, if you've 1 Maccabees 1, verses 20 through 28, and 2 Maccabees, verses 5, verse 11 through 17. You'd see that. And these acts would demonstrate Antiochus' deep hatred for the Jewish people and his desire to eradicate their faith, setting the stage for the Maccabean revolt. 29 through 31. And at this time, and at the appointed time, he will return and come to the south. But this last time it will not happen as it did before. Indeed, ships of Kittim, that's Rome, will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and will return and become indignant at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Mighty forces from him will stand, profane the sanctuary fortresses, and abolish the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. We've heard that before. This describes this final campaign that Antiochus Epiphanes would have against Egypt and the consequences for the Jewish people. That expedition against Egypt would end in humiliation because of Rome's intervention. Again, those ships of Kittim. They represented the Rome's growing power that happened there, embodied by the Roman consul Gaius Publius Leanus, who confronted Antiochus and demanded his withdrawal under threat of war. Antiochus, lacking the strength to oppose Rome, was forced to retreat, which deeply enraged him, and then he would turn that wrath against the Jewish people. Because he was humiliated by Rome, he turned his fury towards them. In his anger, he committed some of the most infamous acts of persecution in Jewish history, including the brutal suppression of Jewish resistance and the enforcement of Greek or Hellenistic practices. The desecration of the temple was a direct assault on the Jewish faith that is there. The Jewish faith that is there. That abomination of desolation he would set up, that would be the worship of Zeus in the temple. In the Jewish temple, they would sacrifice pigs in there, is what they would do. They would sacrifice pigs. Yet God is still sovereign over all this. The passage underscores God's sovereignty amidst human evil, showing how Antiochus' atrocities fulfilled prophecy while also preparing the Jewish people and believers today for greater trials and ultimate redemption. Greater trials and ultimate redemption. Verses 32 through 35. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in intrigue. And some of those who have insight will fall, in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the time of the end, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So as he finishes here, as we come to the end of verse 35, it describes that intense persecution. Using flattering deceit, Antiochus sought to corrupt the Jewish people by enticing them to abandon their faith and embrace Hellenistic practices. So your choices are be killed and persecuted or do this thing. This would lead some to betray their covenant with God, aligning themselves with his, Antiochus' oppressive regime. But the faithful will stand firm. That's what it says in there. Despite widespread persecution, those who truly knew their God stood firm in their faith. Now, yet many will fall by the sword and by the flame. These faithful Jews resisted Antiochus' attempts to undermine their belief. Even at great personal cost, they endured. This resistance of the faithful is echoed in the heroic actions that are described in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 42 through 48. Now, you can find Maccabees online. It's easy to find it. Or if you happen to have a Catholic Bible at your house, you'll be able to find it in there in the Apocrypha. That is there. Where the Maccabees and their followers refused to bow to Antiochus' decrees, choosing instead to fight for the preservation of the Jewish faith. We also see and hear the role of the wise. In this time of crisis, the wise among the Jews played a critical role. These individuals provided spiritual insight and understanding, helping others to discern the times and the seasons and the reason to remain steadfast. Nonetheless, that leadership would come at a cost. Many of them also suffered persecution and death. The example of their faithfulness under pressure offered hope and encouragement. It was also a time of purification. It was a time of spiritual purification, separating the faithful from the unfaithful. The trials refined God's people, demonstrating their loyalty to him amidst overwhelming pressure to conform. And it also foreshadows the end times. The prophecy also points beyond Antiochus' reign. While his actions fulfilled part of Daniel's vision, they are described as lasting until the time of the end, indicating the reign was a foreshadowing of future events, which will be the next time we meet. It prefigures the ultimate tribulation and the testing of God's people in the end times, Matthew 24, 21 through 22, and 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 through 4. So Daniel 11, 1 through 35 is a powerful reminder of the precision and reliability of God's word, containing approximately 135 fulfilled prophecies. These historical fulfillments validate the accuracy of Scripture and provide confidence of the certainty of future prophecies, and particularly of those that are in verses 36 to the end, which point to a future time of tribulation. The passages bridge the fulfilled history and the anticipated eschatological events, offering profound lessons for believers today. So what do we find? God's sovereignty provides peace. God's sovereignty provides peace. This detailed fulfillment shows that God's absolute control over history, including the rise and fall of kings and empires. The assurance of God's sovereignty offers believers peace amid uncertainty. Nothing happens outside His will. His plan is unfolding perfectly. Perfectly. There's hope in God's unchanging plan. In times of chaos and conflict, Daniel 11 reminds us that God remains firmly in control. It's a source of hope for believers, knowing that God's redemptive plan remains unshaken even when circumstances seem bleak. Let me say that again. Knowing that God's redemptive plan remains unshaken even when circumstances seem bleak. We also understand that trials are certain, but God's faithfulness is more certain than the trials. It is a reality of suffering for God's people, but they don't thwart God's purposes. Believers can trust in God's faithfulness that will sustain them through difficulties. Lamentations in chapter 3, God's mercies are new every morning. His ultimate victory is assured. It's a call to faithfulness amid suffering. It's a model of enduring oppression we find there. It's also the idea to avoid the allure of worldly alliances that is there. But absolutely it is the surety of God's word. The precise fulfillment of these prophecies affirms the reliability of Scripture. Believers are called to trust that God will fulfill every promise He has made, including future events. His word is a solid foundation for our faith. As we consider then Daniel 11, let it shape your perspective. Trust in God's sovereignty over every detail of history in your life. In times of trial, cling to His promises and remain steadfast in your faith. Resist the temptation to seek security in worldly powers or possessions. Instead, anchor your hope in the eternal God who is working all things for His glory and His ultimate good. Finally, take heart. His justice will prevail, His word will not fail, and His plan will culminate in the glorious reign of Christ Jesus. Stand firm, knowing that your faith is grounded in a sovereign God's sure and certain promises. Let's pray.